Sorry if this one sounds a little whooshy. It's very whooshy outside. It's tornado season here in the Midwest, and Illinois is being blown off the map. So let's talk about Spider-Man. Nostalgia. Not something I deal with normally. With the internet allowing any media I want at my fingertips, and my ever-growing game collection, I don't often have that nostalgic feeling anymore. Because anytime I want to see or play something, it's right there. Occasionally, though, there is something that I can't quite figure out the title of, and it's just a hazy memory that has me Googling something like Kids Show with Orange Muppet Man. It was Tweenies, by the way. Or maybe it's something I can't easily get my hands on due to a high price or low availability. Things that usually bring me that nostalgic feeling are games from the PlayStation 2 era and old obscure cartoons that nobody bothered to archive, or once again, are only available at a high price. But occasionally, I do manage to find a game at a reasonable price that I've been looking for years. And I get to have that small dose of nostalgia that so many people get to experience when they watch the Justin Bieber movie for the first time since junior high, or find an old game console at a garage sale. And that is exactly what happens to be the case with Ultimate Spider-Man. Yeah, Ultimate Spider-Man was a game I looked for years. It's been at the top of my list of PlayStation 2 games to pick up as long as I've been collecting. And the reason it took me so long to pick it up is because of its high resale price tag. There are still some versions of Ultimate Spider-Man selling for $200 a copy, especially if you're looking for a complete in-box or GameCube version, which regularly sell for $50. But I managed to track it down at a little retro resale shop for a good price, graffiti covered by Kyler. And I was really excited to jump back into this game for the first time in probably 15 years. Kyler, if you're out there watching this, what happened to the case, my guy? This slipcover is obviously printer paper. And also, why did you write it twice? Was this owned by Kyler? Sold and then bought by another Kyler? Who also wrote his name on it just in case Kyler 1 comes back to claim it? So either Kyler 1 or Kyler 2, if you're watching this, you can't have it back, it's mine now. Ultimate Spider-Man is kind of a forgotten game. It isn't usually talked about like the other greats of the Spider-Man game series. Maximum Carnage, the greatest game of all time, Spider-Man the movie game, Spider-Man 2, or even Neversoft Spider-Man are all held up as these monumental titles in Spider-Man game history. And if my memory serves me right, Ultimate Spider-Man is a special game that deserves a spot right alongside those. Ultimate Spider-Man released on the PS2, GameCube, OG Xbox, PC, Game Boy Advance, and Nintendo DS here in America in September of 2005, which just happens to be 8 months after Resident Evil 4. The first Guitar Hero was also released that year, and DMC3, and Tony Hawk's American Wasteland. Maybe Ultimate Spider-Man really wasn't that great and I just really liked 2005. Like every Spider-Man game of this era, Ultimate was published by Activision and developed by Treyarch before both of those companies only made Call of Duty. And here's the thing I find the most fascinating about Ultimate Spider-Man, is that it's a licensed tie-in game, but it doesn't tie into a movie. Ultimate Spider-Man actually ties into the Ultimate Spider-Man comic book, which just so happens to be my favorite Spider-Man comic series. And it's even so tied in that it's even written by Brian Michael Bendis, the writer of Ultimate Spider-Man, who would later go on to create the most well-known Spider-Man legacy hero of all time, Miles Morales. But that's not important to today's topic because that won't happen for another 6 years. Now I remember this game looking gorgeous with its cel-shaded graphics, but when I booted it up, that was not exactly what I was met with. Actually, what I was initially met with was the intro flashing like it should have a seizure warning before it. But that didn't happen every time I booted the game. We're dealing with hardware from the year 2000 here. You kind of just get what you get. Bet it would work better if it was made in 2005. Maybe I've been spoiled by modern day graphics because cel-shaded games generally hold up really well when they were released anytime in the 360 era. Games like Borderlands and Crackdown still look like they could be a really, really, really low-budget modern-day game for the PS5 or Xbox Series X that went for a stylistic graphics choice. But I guess the PS2 was just barely underpowered enough to give us that look that would hold up for years. Now, I'm not trying to say it looks like a trash can that got blown over by the wind on a hot summer day. It actually has a bit of a charm to it with its comic book aesthetic. But things can look a little jagged and blocky. You'll definitely still get a sense of what they were going for with this being a tie-in to the comic books, especially with the way the cutscenes transition from panel to panel. Normally when I'm talking about a tie-in game, let's take Spider-Man 2 for instance, you play through a version of the movie but with a more dumbed-down story that throws in a bunch of unnecessary villains to pad out the game's runtime. But this is actually a much different version of a tie-in game, because it actually takes place within the timeline of the Ultimate Spider-Man comic series. It takes place just 3 months after the Venom arc, which were issues 33 through 38, which lands it somewhere around issue 70. Although the story of the game was later adapted to the comics in the War of the Symbiotes storyline, covered in issues 123 through 128, with a few events being moved to different times, and some things completely missing, which rendered this game no longer canonical, but like Miles Morales, that's future stuff and we're going to ignore it today. The game opens with a recap of the events of the Venom arc, and then proceeds to throw you directly into the action, fighting Venom on a football field before cutting to 3 months later, where Peter is walking and talking with Mary Jane. As soon as Peter started talking, I instantly recognized that voice. And no, it's not anybody you would ever guess. It's Shane Marquette. Yeah, I didn't think I knew who he was either. He voiced Mac in Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends. I'm 26 years old, and I haven't seen anything from the Cartoon Network catalog that didn't have a superhero in it in at least 10 years. Why do I know who that voice is? It's ingrained in my brain somewhere. Anyway, back to the conversation with Peter and Mary Jane, who at this point in the series knows that Peter is Spider-Man, and she's working on repairing the butthole in his suit. I'm sorry, the hole in the butt of his suit. There's a very obvious early 2000s tone to the dialogue in this game. Peter says,
I can't go swinging around in my nerd clothes.
Because it's 2005 and nerds suck, even in a game where you play as a superpowered nerd. Also, if you're playing a Spider-Man video game in 2005, you're probably also a nerd that wears nerd clothes. Nerd. But this is even funnier to me because not even 2 minutes later, they proceed to give you a web-slinging tutorial while Peter is wearing his nerd clothes. And you can just jump down onto the street and run into pedestrians and swing away. It feels kind of weird and immersion breaking. I know there's not a lot of immersion to a 2005 game, especially after just playing Marvel's Midnight Suns, where Peter is so protective of his identity that you have to open him up to reveal his secret identity in a place that only superheroes can get to. He's just here flaunting his identity all over New York. It really shows you how much comics and video games have really changed over the years, as now he's so protective of his identity. But back then, they just kind of let stuff fly and it wasn't a big deal. Like, it wouldn't be the biggest news story on the planet if Peter was just unmasked swinging through the sky. During this brief swinging tutorial is when I started to realize that I may have had on some red and blue rose-tinted glasses when I was thinking about Ultimate Spider-Man. Because swinging straight may be the hardest possible task in the history of the universe. I ran into every single building, car, and pedestrian in New York City in like a minute-long swinging tutorial. I'm sure it didn't seem this bad the first time I played the game. I've definitely been spoiled by the later Spider-Man titles, especially Insomniac Spider-Man. There are some unique swinging mechanics here. Some are a little strange, while others I think just might have been a little too ambitious. When you swing, every web has to latch onto something. This is a very common thing in the later Spider-Man games, unlike the greatest game of all time where you can web the clouds. But the detection of where the web line is supposed to go isn't quite always where it should be. Sometimes the web will hit where it needs to be and you can continue to swing freely. But other times it'll get stuck behind you on a building you just passed, and then you swing around the side of the building and smack into it like you're playing Spider-Man pinball. Or 9 times out of 10, there's nothing close enough for you to even web to, and you just plummet to the streets. You will eventually get used to these weird web swinging mechanics, and I actually really started to like the boost it allows you to do to speed up your web swing at the back half of it. But by getting used to it, I don't mean you'll get good at it. You'll probably get enough of a hang of it that you can get from point A to point B, as long as you mix in a lot of web zips in between. But no matter how much you do it, you're still slapping into walls, pushing you back the exact opposite direction of where you were trying to go. You'll just get used to turning Spidey around. When Peter finally gets his suit, you'll next find yourself in a fighting tutorial. The fighting in the game is very basic. Nothing too crazy. Square button for light attacks, triangle for heavy, and circle makes him dive like an idiot. Dark Souls hasn't been invented yet, so there's no dodge rolls, but you can jump out of the way when your Spidey sense goes off, and it works about 12% of the time. But the coolest mechanic is the requirement of webbing up all of your enemies after you defeat them, so the cops can come arrest them. If you're fighting a gang of guys and knock 3 down and 1 is still left standing, if you didn't web the other 3 to the ground, or to a light pole, they can get back up and start fighting again. After the tutorial is over, it's time for Peter Parks' car to go to school, where he completely skips school. He doesn't even go in the building. What do you expect from someone with rad 80s Tony Hawk hair? He's literally too cool for school. That might be the worst joke this show's seen so far. I'm sorry for that one, guys. I really am. Instead of going to school, Peter races the Fantastic Four's Human Torch through the city. And this is just the first of many Ultimate Universe Marvel characters to make an appearance throughout the game. You'll see the likes of Wolverine, Sharon Carter, and Samuel L. Jackson. This race introduces city goals, which is the game's way of making a 2-hour game look like a 5.5-hour game. In between each mission, you'll have to complete a set amount of city goals to unlock the next mission. These goals consist of races around the city, combat tours where you'll travel the streets of New York beating down groups of thugs, city events, which are just miscellaneous events going on in the city. There are things like purse snatches and helping people that fell off their bikes to the hospital, and helping people falling out of windows get to the ground safely. Because gravity is New York City's worst enemy. Actually, it's Spiderman giving him the old spin cycle on the way to the hospital.
I really don't think I need to go to the hospital. I just stubbed my toe.
The last city goal is collecting tokens, which if you couldn't figure that out, it's collecting tokens. Landmarks, comic book covers, and mystery tokens. They're huge floating tokens, you really can't miss them. I decided to take the same approach I do with the Saints Row game's respect level for the city goals. So once I was able to do them, I spent an hour or so just doing city goals, so I never had to do any of them again. And now that we're this deep in, let's get to the coolest feature of Ultimate Spider-Man that never made it to any other game, Venom. No, not that he's just in the game. We got Topher Grace.
Now, let's talk about how we're going to destroy the spider.
But he's a main playable character you do half of the missions in the game with. And when you first get control of Venom, you're sent to eat a child. That's not a joke. You eat the balloon kid from Spider-Man 2. And I see now why we never got to play as Venom again in a game after this. Much like the comics, this game doesn't shy away from the darker aspects of superhero stories. Venom is a monster that feeds off of human life. And it doesn't care if it's a kid's life.
Why's that? Keep you from eating more babies? You eat babies. You have to survive. Everyone knows that. Ain't your fault.
We eat berries and mushrooms, you fool!
You eat babies.
Now, I'm not saying that I like that Venom eats kids, but I like that they weren't afraid to go there to get the point across. This is a consistent mechanic while playing as Venom. You need to feed because Venom is constantly sucking the life out of Eddie. So while you're playing, you have to make time to feed on pedestrians and enemies to keep going. Not only does he feed, Venom can also scale walls with his claws, use his tentacles to do ranged attacks, jump the height of skyscrapers, and web zip, but with his tentacles. Tentacle zip? That just sounds gross. We're calling it a web zip, but with tentacles. As Venom, you'll be fighting off the police and Silver Sable's private army, using his claws, tentacles, and picking up cars and throwing them at helicopters to give his gameplay an almost prototype Hulk Ultimate Destruction feel. He also fights Wolverine in a bar in his first mission, And I wanted to talk about that because Wolverine does this creepy whisper thing the whole time. And I could not bring that up.
That's my bike to smash this place up with. What are you supposed to be anyway? I'm the best at what I do.
When we switch back to Peter Pork and Beans, we're next tasked with chasing after the Rhino and kicking him in the ding-ding.
Kick the Rhino guy in the ding-ding and
And on our way to...
kick the Rhino guy in the ding-ding and
You have to chase the Rhino and not let him get too far while saving civilians caught in his destruction. This is something that would be borrowed by Spider-Man Miles Morales about 15 years later. At this point, I thought the chases were really cool. Until it became every other mission, and I had to hear Electro say, "My grandmother's faster than you," 45 times because I got more than 3 feet away from him. And I had to keep restarting the chase over and over again. Or maybe I'm just sour on the aspect because during the Beetle chase, my map was opening every 12 seconds. Until at 12:30 a.m., I was dismantling a PS2 controller to find a single dog hair under the select button. I finished that chase pretty quick after that issue was resolved. And the game continued on with this format of chase as Spider-Man, boss fight as Spider-Man, chase as Venom, boss fight as Venom. Rinse and repeat till the end of the game, with a couple hundred times of hearing Peter say,
I gotta go pick up my check at Daily Bugle.
200 times in between. So was Ultimate Spider-Man as good as I remember? Not exactly. But if I wasn't talking about it in a post-Insomniac Spider-Man world, probably. Insomniac completely changed the landscape of Spider-Man, and even superhero games in general. It's nearly impossible to compete with. But that doesn't mean Ultimate Spider-Man still isn't worth playing in the post-Insomniac era, even if it's just for the Venom stuff. Sure, the controls are dated, and swinging is nearly impossible to do correctly, but they took a lot of big swings with original ideas, and they all held up great to this day. Well, maybe not the City Goals. Plus, the story is really good. It's written by a comic creator at the level of his comics. So there's a lot there just from the comic story perspective. What I'm saying is, I still think that Ultimate Spider-Man is highly underrated and unappreciated. It should at least definitely be mentioned more, because for the time, it truly was a great Spider-Man game. And that's pretty much all I have. But before you go, I want everyone to look under their seats. And for those of you that aren't sitting, look under your feet. Nothing there. Might be stuck to like the underside of your foot. You found it? That's right. Everybody here today gets the opportunity to subscribe to this channel. You get to subscribe. And you get to subscribe. And you get to subscribe. And I can only point this way because the camera is directly in front of me. Everybody gets to subscribe! Everybody gets to subscribe to see when I talk about some other comic book game or movie. And as a little bonus, you can comment below, tell me if you liked Ultimate Spider-Man, liked the video, or just tell me about your pet bird. I don't care. Now go play Ultimate Spider-Man.
Oh, let's watch our temper here. There's children present.
Penny!